Great. Okay. Well, first, I need to start with an apology. This was supposed to be a dual paper. My team leader is Andy Wier. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today. So you're stuck with me, a mere sociologist. I'm no theologian. He was going to bring all the theology, so I'm going to try my best to cover the theology side of this and quite an important part of this talk. But interwoven into this is some of my sociological reflections. Thank you. I think the first place to start really is positionality. For those of you that don't know, Church Army's research unit has been studying pioneer mission for the last 25 years, particularly adept, or adept as I like to think at least, at tracking the growth of fresh expressions across the United Kingdom and Ireland. But within our team, we are quite diverse. And for example, Andy is a practical theologian. He's very interested in operant theology versus espoused theology. Whereas I am, like I said, a sociologist. I was rescued out of university culture about a year ago and brought into Church Army. And my background was actually studying conversion in what are popularly known as cults. And so now I've been recruited to study conversion into a religion that actually has a God. But that's if that before he goes out and get in a lot of trouble, but there you go. So what I want to do is reflect on two seminal publications that came out in 2004. It's been 20 years. One you will most likely have heard of, which is Mission Shaped Church. The other is a lesser known one called Inside Out, which is a Church Army publication. But Mission Shaped Church, for those of you that aren't aware, really was the starting point for fresh expressions within the Church of England, and it's the first point at which we see was a fresh expression back then. It was in what was it? It's on my slide somewhere. It will come back up. But ultimately, this was the point at which fresh expressions started to get tracked, and George Lings did that with us in Church Army in the research unit. And the focus of this really was to look at the ways in which pioneering is happening across the Church of England. But as you'll see, and the publication I'm more familiar with is Inside Out in the next slide, it was the opposite kind of approach in which Inside Out focused specifically on evangelism and very seldom mentioned this concept of new emerging communities, fresh expressions, and so on. This model, by the way, doesn't exist in the original publication. This is my work. All sociologists love models, and so I had attempted to modelize the theology of evangelism being espoused in that document or in that publication, and that's the best I can come up with so far. I'm happy to be wrong. I'm sure you can come up with that at the end, and you can challenge me on it. But essentially, this was published in the same year. It focuses on, like I said, on evangelism and very rarely mentions FXCs or church planting. But the two combined are really interesting. When you combine both publications, we get a bigger picture of what was starting to come through 20 years ago. So, some reflections on that, and I should say at this point that one of my favourite pedagogical tools is to make really outlandish, absolutist statements to generate discussion. So if you hear something that offends you, I'm not sorry, but we can talk about it at the end. And I want to start by talking about the impact of Mission Shaped Church, and I'd rather humbly put "and Inside Out" in brackets because I don't think it had as much impact. I want to talk about a mixed ecology in the Church of England, especially. So the term a mixed economy was first used after the publication of Mission Shaped Church, and as we know, that's now morphed into a mixed ecology. And really what this is an attempt to articulate the cohabitation of church and fresh expressions mutually supporting each other, sometimes in the same space. Certainly that was the original intention as far as I can glean. The aim was for this mixed approach to become the norm, but it would include things like church planting, fresh expression, but also things like chaplaincy work, which was quite novel, as far as I'm led to believe. I was quite young when it came out. As a result of some of the discussion that emerged around mixed economy, we start to see some concerns around the use of the term mixed economy, which led to a mixed ecology term being used. And essentially, it comes down to words and semantics, but they're really important. So if you have a mixed economy, what you're essentially having is a kind of a capitalist approach to church planting with a few bits of socialism, which assumes this level of the most efficient succeeds. Whereas mixed ecology suggests a healthy ecosystem with varying parts working together as part of a whole. So some of my recent observations, this is the sociology side, over the last year of researching with Church Army, is that we've started to see genuine growth occurring in initiatives that wouldn't really be considered church plants, but you definitely would consider them fresh expressions and new worshiping communities. And in particular, I would highlight the Diocese of Carlisle as a really good example of where they're doing this. Yeah, they're doing this really well, to be honest. I can't praise them enough. But in light of all of that, we still have traditional approaches to church planting as being the assumed proper status compared to what new worshiping communities are facing. And that goes both ways. That's actually rarely the church planters that are saying that. It's the actual people leading the fresh expressions themselves who almost guiltily try and like underplay what they really are because they feel that they're not proper or not suggested or not respected as being proper. And I think some other observations, I mean, I should have said at the beginning, I'm a church planter with New Frontiers, for all the good and the bad that comes with that. And I'm currently planting a church in Germany, but I spent loads of time planting churches in the Northwest. And I think my observations from kind of the evangelical charismatic backgrounds is that they lag behind this approach on mixed ecology. And I think this linear kind of traditional approach to church planting following a Sunday worshiping community model is certainly something we're still seeing in that sphere, whereas that's then given the Church of England or Anglican initiatives a real opportunity to fill the gap. And again, look at the church, look at the Diocese of Carlisle, they are filling that gap with some really innovative fresh expressions. You can tell I just recently completed a project. And so a true mixed ecology, my observation, seems to be confused or often not fully practiced across the Church of England fully. And what I mean by that is that I think actually, from my observation, a lot of places we're seeing a mixed economy and not a mixed ecology. So evangelism and church planting, our main argument here, or this is the bit Andy would say, the main argument is a greater consideration should be given to the relationship between the theology of evangelism and church planting. So church plants, new worshiping communities require a soteriology which fuels a culture of evangelism in practice. Two dominant paradigms which dictate the models, strategies dictate models are usually serving first, pioneering, or worship first resource approach. And both lead or can lead to genuine growth. Otherwise, church growth is often reliant upon what we call transfer growth. And the overall picture is then not one expanding, but one plateauing at best. And so in post-Christendom contemporary evangelism, it has an embedded embarrassment. I know Pass was here last year and he's done a lot of work on this. And I really resonate with what Pass is saying here. If witnessing about Jesus is framed with an ontology of wrath, lostness, and atonement that is no longer acceptable or intelligible to most people, then speaking about Jesus in any salvific sense may be experienced as embarrassing. And so the tricky missiological and soteriological issues being faced in contemporary society need to be tackled, avoiding an implicit assumption that good church planting models equate to evangelism in practice. And so, yeah, the assumption there being that if we have a great model and we have good leadership in place, then evangelism will just happen. And the reality on the ground is that that's not the case. And so from a church army context, we have over 30 centres of mission across the country, and they're all set up in partnership with host dioceses. And over the last 10 years, we've been visiting rather rigorously, religiously visiting every year at the same point of the year, and tracking their growth. We have conversations with the leaders and the evangelists on the ground, qualitatively as well. And so it's become a long-term research project called Recalling the Journey. And within our centres of mission, what we're finding is that it's a great way of achieving our church army's DARE strategy, which is doing, advocating, resourcing, and enabling evangelism, then nearly all centres of mission have objectives around the establishment of fresh expressions of church or new worshipping communities. And this really varies across all of the centres of mission. Some evangelists feel really passionately called to set up fresh expressions and to lead that strategically, whereas other evangelists on the ground feel really passionately called to the individual and don't necessarily feel strategically minded around that. And so that's been an interesting, I wouldn't say quagmire, that would be the wrong word, but that's been an interesting thing to navigate, I think, for us as an organisation, but for us as researchers tracking that, it's been fascinating and really fun to watch. And so all of this suggests that although Inside Out and Mission Shaped Church said very little about the opposite end of the spectrum that they both cover, what we're finding is that there's a really close relationship between evangelism and fresh expressions of church, theology of evangelism, I should say, and fresh expressions of church, being imagined by those responsible for managing those initiatives. And so there's some interpretations of Ephesians 4:11 where there is a clear and distinct difference between evangelistic and apostolic ministry. I know from a New Frontier background, that's like a religiously vehemently defined stance. Actually, what we need to start thinking that is, although this distinction is helpful, or can be helpful because it's biblical, it also can risk oversimplifying. And so I think there's a point at which we need to ask ourselves, are we trying to have a one-size-fits-all approach with our evangelists in training, with our evangelists on the ground, and our pioneering? And so I think then we like tidy typologies, but the reality is that on the ground it's very messy, and there is a beauty in that mess. And I think we're starting to try and appreciate that. Well, we're trying to appreciate what measurement looks like in terms of mess on the ground. And so evangelists come in all shapes and sizes and exercise their ministries in varied ways, which is what Inside Out suggested that would happen. And then some wider considerations which are more fuels for conversation. I've not covered it, but there's obviously a power dynamic, and it was mentioned earlier in the main session between the funder and the funded. So at what point does that power dynamic influence or potentially encroach upon the context in which they're in? So often we all put funded church army evangelists into initiatives, and every year or every 3 years they get a review, and we then have to say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we did this next? And then they'll take that and they'll really try and do that. But sometimes I think there maybe is a miscommunication between what they feel is best for their context and what maybe the organisation and the diocese feels is best. And then evangelism and or church planting / fresh expressions that fly under the radar. We're coming across loads of fresh expressions that simply just fly under the radar at diocese level, but also since joining Church Army and kind of coming out as a fresh expressionist, if you like, in a New Frontier church, I've come across a whole host of fresh expressions that are masqueraded as church plants or haven't even been mentioned. And the reality is that even New Frontiers, I say that with a little bit of kind of tongue in cheek, even New Frontiers are doing fresh expressions, and I think there's a trend moving towards contextual evangelism happening more broadly. And then some of the other stuff around connection of evangelists and evangelism with other ministries. Again, I think historically, maybe outside the Church of England, I think the Church of England does as well, but there's often been a siloed approach towards ministry. And so what does it look like for an evangelist to also be a pastor and to also be a prophet and all of the other sorts of gifts that exist within our churches? So conclusions then, 20 years on from the publication of Mission Shaped Church and Inside Out, the relationship between evangelism and church planting still needs to be better understood, or the theology of evangelism and church planting still needs to be better understood. And with this in mind, Church Army's research unit have recently launched a new stream of research on effective evangelism. That's why I exist. We look forward to collaborating with other planters, practitioners, and theologians in exploring these issues over the years ahead. Thank you.